How can we interpret a phenomenon that combines spiritual elements, collective emotional repercussions, and the persistent pursuit of justice? This question has intensified since the medium Ty William, known for her sober style and focus on verifiable psychic communications within the English-speaking spiritualist community, transmitted a series of messages attributed to the spirit of Yu Menglong, the actor whose death continues to generate debate, suspicion, and deep social unease. Each of these transmissions, presented in her live stream sessions, has provoked massive reactions, both among those seeking answers and among those who refuse to accept any unconventional interpretation of the case. During his most recent intervention, Ty William asserted that Yu Menglong's spirit is in a state of clarity, serenity, and conscious observation, located, according to his description, on a higher plane of existence, but still bound to the cycle of the three realms. For those following the public evolution of the case, this statement not only reignites the debate over the circumstances of his death, but also reshapes the emotional interpretation surrounding the tragedy. In an environment where official information is scarce and explanations are insufficient for a significant portion of the public, the emergence of these spiritual narratives serves as a new point of reference. But beyond the symbolism and comforting words, what mechanisms are really driving this crisis? How can the interaction between collective grief, spiritual narratives, institutional distrust, and public memory be interpreted from a formal analytical framework? The objective of this analysis is to break down all these elements with absolute neutrality, focusing solely on the informational structure, the internal coherence of the messages, and their role in contemporary social discourse. In this rewriting, the figure of Yu Menglong will not be interpreted through an emotional lens, but rather as a focal point of a broader communicative phenomenon involving public perceptions, symbolic narratives, and social responses to a loss that many consider unjust. Similarly, Ty Williams' interventions will be examined as manifestations within a narrative framework, without passing judgment on the truth or falsity of his abilities. The purpose is to offer a clear, rigorous, and structured reconstruction of the content, maintaining terminological precision, a formal tone, and analytical neutrality. This approach will allow us to understand how these narratives develop, are amplified, and become integrated within a context marked by socio-political tensions, divergent interpretations, and a collective desire to find meaning. From here, a detailed exploration will begin, delving into the original factors behind the controversy, the elements that fueled its spread, and the way Yu Menglong's story has become a focal point of conversation, both within and beyond the artistic sphere. The starting point of this controversy lies in the repeated appearance of messages attributed to the spirit of Yu Menglong, disseminated by the medium Ty William in successive live broadcasts. To understand the magnitude of the phenomenon, it is necessary first to analyze the context in which these messages emerge, both in emotional and sociocultural terms, and then to examine the motivations that, according to the accounts themselves, would have prompted the spiritual entity to attempt to establish communication with the earthly realm. Although the focus of this analysis remains strictly neutral, it is pertinent to identify the central narrative elements and the structure that sustains their propagation. In the opening minutes of the broadcast that generated the most buzz, Ty Williams stated that he had no prior knowledge of who Yu Menglong was or of his significance in the Chinese art scene. This statement became one of the initial pillars of her narrative, an attempt to underscore that the spiritual contact had been spontaneous and not conditioned by fame, media background, or external expectations. From an analytical perspective, this argument serves to establish narrative credibility by suggesting that the medium had no material or symbolic incentives to alter the information received. At the same time, this assertion is what opens the door for the audience to interpret the content as a message independent of any personal agenda. From that point on, the medium describes Yu Menglong's spirit as being on a higher plane within the three realms, a term derived from traditional Asian cosmological structures that, within the narrative, serves to place the protagonist in an intermediate state, neither completely detached from the material world nor trapped on a lower plane. According to the account, this state of existence would allow him to observe earthly reality with clarity, without being affected by overwhelming human emotions or energetic interference. His connection with those who pray for him is presented as a bond sustained by thoughts and vibrations, rather than by physical mechanisms. The medium adds that, according to the information she has perceived, Yu Menglong would have the ability to be in multiple places simultaneously due to an alleged change in the energy density associated with his new condition. In other words, the narrative suggests that the spirit would not be bound by space or time, and that this freedom would allow it to hear all prayers directed toward it, even those formulated only in thought. In analytical terms, This claim functions as a mechanism to explain how a physically absent figure can remain emotionally and symbolically linked to a large community. One of the most significant elements in this initial phase is the medium's insistence that the spirit is neither held captive nor in a state of suffering, but rather in a plane considered luminous and stable. This stands in direct contrast to unofficial accounts circulating on social media, according to which Yu Menglong's death was surrounded by unjust acts or malicious intent. The spiritual narrative makes a clear distinction between the spirit's current state and the events that would have caused its death. According to the message conveyed, any attempt to imprison or hold back its essence would have been futile due to its energetic strength and the nature of the plane to which it had ascended. Within this narrative logic, the spirit attributes the physical and emotional deterioration of those directly or indirectly responsible for its death to the consequences of their own actions, not to supernatural retaliation. The message is not framed in terms of punishment, but as an inevitable effect of a moral or energetic imbalance. This formulation is relevant from an analytical perspective, as it shifts the interpretation toward the idea of internal causality, a principle according to which human actions would have natural repercussions for those who carry them out. Another crucial component in this first stage is the mention of an alleged destiny pact, a recurring idea in various spiritual traditions that describes human life as a sequence agreed upon before birth. According to the medium, Yu Menglong had communicated that his death, far from being accidental, was part of a prearranged process to fulfill a broader social function, to reveal structural tensions within his country's political and artistic system. This framing introduces a significant narrative twist, as it links his death to a transcendental purpose that transcends his personal journey. The narrative describes this mission as a mechanism designed to expose the dynamics of oppression, control, and imbalance present in the Chinese sociopolitical environment. For those following the case, this account provides an interpretation of the tragedy that seeks to give it meaning, placing it within a framework larger than mere individual loss. Although this analysis does not evaluate the veracity of such claims, it does identify their function: to transform a painful event into a symbol of collective resistance or social awakening. The appearance of Tianha Tiannu, another medium who reportedly received similar messages, helps reinforce the narrative structure. The coincidence between their accounts and those of Tai William serves as a point of support for those who believe in the phenomenon's authenticity, while also adding complexity in terms of communicative analysis. In particular, this second testimony provides details about intense emotions attributed to the spirit, especially when reacting to images showing the removal of the floral offerings left by its followers. According to this narrative, such actions would have sparked a feeling of profound incomprehension and prompted society to reflect on the value of life and respect for human dignity. One of the most detailed moments in the spiritual account is the description of the day of his death, conveyed by the medium Tianha Tiannu. According to her account, a woman close to power circles had pressured him to attend a social gathering with influential individuals. The narrative suggests that he initially refused and that, from that point on, a sequence of events unfolded in which he was allegedly subjected to acts of humiliation and violence. Although this analysis does not seek to validate the facts, it does acknowledge that this part of the account contributes to solidifying a clear image: the idea that the protagonist was a victim of external forces with broad scope and influence. The description continues with the appearance of substances that would have impaired its ability to react, and with the intervention of individuals who, according to the account, acted out of power games, rivalries, and hierarchical social dynamics. Again, the function of these details in the narrative is not to establish legal culpability, but to provide a structured explanation for the emotions attributed to the spirit and its presumed motivation to communicate. Throughout these accounts, a central theme recurs: the call for reflection and social cohesion. The message attributed to the spirit suggests that society needs to question systems of authority and recognize patterns that, according to the spiritual narrative, would allow similar cases to recur. The focus is not on revenge, but on understanding and collective action as a tool for prevention. Taken together, the analyzed elements form the narrative foundation that gives rise to the phenomenon. From a formal standpoint, these messages seek to reinterpret a tragic event through concepts such as mission, transcendence, destiny, and collective responsibility. Their function within the communicative sphere is to provide an explanatory framework that gives meaning to the loss, while fueling a broader social conversation about justice and memory. The rapid circulation of messages attributed to the spirit of Yu Menglong, spread by both Tai William and Tianha Tiannu, triggered a media phenomenon that spread with remarkable speed. The interaction between social media, video platforms, and specialized digital communities created an environment in which information, whether verified or not, spread with an intensity that far exceeded the strictly spiritual realm. From an analytical perspective, this stage represents the transition from an intimate narrative to a public event, conditioned by collective emotions and by disparate interpretations of the meaning of the messages conveyed. In the first few days after the broadcasts aired, digital platforms saw a notable increase in mentions, debates, and derivative content. The audience did not react uniformly, rather, three clearly distinct currents emerged. The first group consisted of those who accepted the messages as a legitimate form of spiritual communication, interpreting them as an attempt by Yu Menglong himself to clarify the circumstances of his death and to convey an ethical appeal to society. This group adopted the narratives with a strong emotional component and integrated them into their own grieving process, transforming the broadcasts into a symbolic space of support. The second group consisted of individuals who adopted a skeptical or critical stance, not necessarily toward Ty William himself, but toward the possibility that spiritual claims could be used to influence public opinion in a case that was still sensitive. From this perspective, questions were raised regarding the authenticity of the messages, the use of symbolic elements, and the way such content could influence social perception of an investigation that had yet to be clarified. This group emphasized the need to distinguish between spiritual expression and the analysis of verifiable facts, underscoring that both planes must be kept separate to avoid biased interpretations. The third group, smaller in number but highly active, focused its attention on the socio-political dimension of the phenomenon. It interpreted the spiritual narrative as a reflection of the discontent existing in certain sectors of the population, particularly in relation to issues of justice, transparency, and institutional pressure. For this sector, the messages conveyed were not merely metaphysical accounts, but symbolic expressions of the collective desire to denounce inequalities or abusive behaviors perceived in the circumstances surrounding Yu Menglong's death. The convergence of these currents generated an amplification dynamic that transformed the case into a high-visibility phenomenon. Digital diffusion algorithms also played a significant role. Videos featuring excerpts from the broadcasts, annotated interpretations, spontaneous user analyses, and compilations of clips were repeatedly recommended, accelerating the content's spread. Continuous feedback between the audience and the platform kept the topic among the most discussed for several days in Asian entertainment communities and in transnational spiritual circles. On an emotional level, the case quickly took on a collective dimension. Yu Menglong's figure, beyond his artistic career, became a symbol onto which thousands of users projected their personal concerns, expectations, and reflections. This transformation of the individual into a symbol is a common phenomenon in high-impact media narratives. The personal story ceases to belong solely to the protagonist and becomes a space shared by the community that interprets it. In this context, the spiritual narrative offered by Ty William served as a catalyst that allowed latent concerns to be articulated. A particularly significant element during this media phase was the reaction to the alleged removal of flowers placed in memory of the actor. This episode, disseminated through videos and photographs, acquired considerable symbolic significance. For some members of the audience, the action was seen as an act of disrespect toward the memory of the deceased, and as a sign that his story continued to generate discomfort in certain sectors. According to the narrative conveyed by Tien Ha Tien Nu, this event would have provoked an intense emotional reaction in the spirit, described through expressions of bewilderment and moral questioning. Regardless of the spiritual interpretation, the social dimension of the incident did generate a wave of commentary, analysis, and debate about the meaning of the offerings, the legitimacy of removing them, and collective sensitivity toward public mourning. The virality of these events highlighted a phenomenon characteristic of the contemporary digital environment: the condensation of collective emotions into brief but extremely intense cycles. The case of Yu Menglong illustrates how an initial narrative can evolve into a broader, more complex discussion with emotional, political, and cultural ramifications. The constant interplay between spiritual narratives, perceived institutional responses, and public expectations fueled the ongoing debate. Likewise, it is relevant to examine how social criticism emerged as part of the conversation. Some segments of the audience interpreted the spiritual narratives as a symbolic call to question practices deemed unjust within the entertainment system, highlighting issues such as workplace pressure, power dynamics, and the vulnerability of public figures to institutional forces. Although these interpretations are not part of the explicit messages conveyed by the mediums, they do reflect how society reconfigures emotionally charged narratives to suit its own concerns. At this point, it is worth noting that the spiritual narrative did not operate in isolation. The communicative structure of the digital environment allowed multiple voices to join the discourse, whether to expand, nuance, or question it. This multiplicity contributed to the case acquiring a resonance that transcended its original nature. The active participation of users from various regions and backgrounds turned the story into an international phenomenon, especially within Spanish speaking communities interested in spiritual topics, social justice, or Asian entertainment. The media stage also revealed a characteristic pattern in this type of phenomenon: the tendency to seek meaning in events that are difficult to understand from a strictly rational or legal standpoint. When official explanations are perceived as insufficient or unsatisfactory, alternative narratives, including spiritual ones, can gain traction as interpretive frameworks that lend coherence to a collective experience of loss or uncertainty. In this case, the figure of Yu Menglong became a focal point for reflection on values such as justice, dignity, and public memory. In summary, the media frenzy surrounding the dissemination of messages attributed to the actor's spirit had a considerable impact on multiple levels: emotional, social, and symbolic. The rapid spread of the content was facilitated by the structure of digital platforms, the diversity of public interpretations, and the emotional charge associated with the case. This combination of factors gave rise to an environment in which the spiritual narrative became integrated as just one element within an ongoing social debate, contributing to the formation of a broad and deeply interconnected conversation. The third phase of this analysis requires examining how the communicative response surrounding the case was structured, both from the perspective of the mediums who disseminated the messages attributed to Yu Menglong and from the social reaction generated by those transmissions. Although there is no official crisis management strategy in the traditional sense, since the messages originated in a spiritual realm rather than from formal institutions, it is possible to identify operational patterns, communication decisions, and resulting effects that allow the case to be evaluated under the fundamental principles of contemporary crisis management. The first point to consider is Ty Williams' initial response. The medium did not adopt a reactive stance or prepare a scheduled statement. On the contrary, her communication occurred spontaneously via a live stream. From a technical standpoint, this type of public appearance constitutes an unplanned response, in which the speaker exposes sensitive information without a prior framework of control. This format has two simultaneous effects. On the one hand, spontaneity can be perceived as a gesture of authenticity. On the other, the absence of filters increases the risk of divergent interpretations, emotional amplification, and loss of conceptual clarity. In the specific case of Tai William, the narrative conveyed focused on providing detailed information about Yu Menglong's alleged spiritual state and on describing visualizations or perceptions associated with the events leading up to his death. From a crisis management perspective, this strategy is based on a classic principle: providing context to reduce uncertainty. In situations where official information is limited or being questioned, the emergence of an alternative narrative can serve as a source of guidance, even when its nature is symbolic or spiritual. The medium did not adopt an accusatory tone or explicitly position herself against any institution, which contributed to the narrative being interpreted primarily as a spiritual exposition rather than a formal denunciation. However, the breadth of the content disseminated, including detailed references to intense emotions, suffering, alleged aggressors, and power dynamics, led part of the audience to interpret her words as an indirect commentary on circumstances linked to the actor's death. This created a second layer of communicative crisis: the tension between the symbolic and the literal. When a spiritual message is received by thousands of people with diverse expectations, the scope for conflicting interpretations expands significantly. The second key figure in this phase, the medium Tianha Tiannu, adopted a different strategy. Her transmissions were presented as edited videos and published afterward, a form of communication that allows for greater control over the content. This approach can be understood as a structured response, in which the broadcaster carefully selects the statements they wish to share and regulates the intensity of the information revealed. The coincidence between certain aspects of his account and the messages disseminated by Tai William generated a narrative reinforcement effect that amplified the perceived credibility among a segment of the audience. However, the emergence of both testimonies also produced a phenomenon commonly observed in social and media crises: the fragmentation of public discourse. While some users interpreted the congruence of the messages as a sign of spiritual coherence, others considered it evidence of the spread of unverified information that could unduly influence public opinion. This division is characteristic of scenarios in which non-institutional actors become sources of alternative information, especially on emotionally sensitive topics. Crisis management analysis also requires examining how the spiritual narrative addressed collective sensitivity. In several parts of the messages attributed to the spirit of Yu Menglong, reference was made to the idea that his death was the result of a pact of destiny or a mission related to revealing social imbalances. From a strategic communication perspective, this approach can be interpreted as an attempt to reframe the tragedy, transforming a painful event into a process that, according to the narrative, would serve a broader purpose. This narrative mechanism is common in the emotional management of traumatic events, as it allows recipients to cognitively reorganize the meaning of the event. However, reframing a high impact emotional event carries communicative risks. If the audience perceives the reframing as an attempt to soften, justify, or reinterpret facts that have not yet been clarified, an adverse reaction may occur, characterized by a loss of credibility or accusations of symbolic manipulation. In this case, although there was no explicit intention to replace official accounts, the emotional depth of the messages caused the narrative to occupy an intermediate space, not entirely detached from reality, but neither anchored in verifiable facts. A relevant aspect in this phase was the emergence of derivative content created by users who reinterpreted the messages according to their own perceptions. From a crisis management perspective, this is a form of discourse decentralization, a phenomenon characteristic of social media environments. A crisis that originally might have remained confined to a small circle quickly becomes a mosaic of interpretations, each with its own structure and scope. Decentralization makes it difficult to establish stable reference points and increases the volatility of public discourse. Analyzing the audience's response is also fundamental. The audience acted as a multiplier, amplifying, reinterpreting, or questioning the content, thereby creating a dynamic ecosystem. Among the recurring comments, a tendency to request clarity, justice, and transparency was observed, elements that typically emerge in contexts where the available information is perceived as incomplete. The spiritual narrative, by offering an alternative explanatory framework, temporarily filled that void, although without replacing the need for verifiable data. On the other hand, the account made no explicit attempt to hold specific institutions or figures accountable, which prevented direct conflictive escalations. This relative neutrality allowed the narrative to remain in a symbolic and emotional realm, reducing the likelihood of defensive reactions from external actors. From a crisis management perspective, this narrative decision can be interpreted as an effective mechanism for preventing unnecessary confrontations. Finally, it is important to highlight that the collection of messages attributed to the spirit of Yu Menglong included an explicit invitation to calm, reflection, and the choice of ethical behaviors. This orientation toward moderation served as a counterweight to the emotional intensity of the narrative. In terms of strategic communication, this type of message serves to redirect the audience's emotional energy toward non-confrontational actions, providing a temporary closure that reduces the likelihood of impulsive escalations. Overall, the communicative management observed in this case cannot be classified within traditional institutional crisis models, but it does exhibit characteristics that allow for a structured analysis. Spontaneous decisions, narrative reinforcement across different sources, decentralization of discourse, and the symbolic orientation of messages shaped a hybrid response that, although not designed according to formal parameters, exerted a considerable impact on public perception and the development of social debate. The final phase of this analysis requires examining how spiritual narratives, public reactions, and social interpretations have shaped the symbolic legacy of the Yu Menglong case, as well as possible future scenarios. At this stage, the focus is no longer exclusively on the messages transmitted by the mediums, but on the cumulative effect of these accounts on collective memory, the social perception of justice, and the relationship between institutions, public figures, and the citizenry. One of the most significant elements is the way the case has transcended its initial scope to become a framework for reflection on broader issues. The vulnerability of artists within highly hierarchical systems, the tension between institutional power and individual freedom, and society's need for narratives that give meaning to traumatic events. Although spiritual interpretations do not establish legal responsibilities or constitute verifiable evidence, they have contributed to creating a discursive space in which the public feels authorized to express concerns, indignation, or desires for clarification. From a communicative analysis perspective, the account attributed to the spirit of Yu Menglong has functioned as a vector articulating collective concerns, especially around the sense of powerlessness that can arise when a case remains shrouded in obscurity or when official information is perceived as insufficient. The narrative's emphasis on concepts such as destiny, transcendental mission, and social purpose has allowed part of the audience to reframe the tragedy within a symbolic framework that mitigates the individual emotional impact and facilitates its integration into a shared narrative. Another relevant aspect is the relationship between public mourning and the construction of community identity. The story of Yu Menglong, as interpreted through the messages circulated, has been adopted by various digital communities as a symbol of resistance against dynamics perceived as unjust. This phenomenon does not necessarily involve an explicit confrontation with institutions, but it does reflect the way users reconfigure individual narratives to align them with their own ethical and social concerns. In this way, the actor's figure becomes an emotional point of reference from which the community articulates debates about protection, dignity, and vulnerability. In this sense, the spiritual narrative has played a dual role. On the one hand, it has offered solace to those seeking to understand the actor's death from a symbolic perspective. On the other, it has served as a catalyst for public conversation on sensitive topics. This dual role illustrates how, in certain contexts, unverifiable narratives can gain traction, not because they are taken literally, but because they provide a framework for collective emotional expression. In scenarios where information is limited or subject to questioning, these types of narratives serve as a transitional mechanism that keeps the discussion alive without requiring definitive conclusions. The narrative also included an explicit ethical call to action attributed to the actor's spirit. According to the messages circulated, the intention was not to incite confrontation, but to foster reflection and the conscious choice of values such as solidarity, justice, and empathy. From a crisis management perspective, this approach helped mitigate the risk of the social debate devolving into impulsive or confrontational expressions. Instead of promoting specific demands or direct accusations, the narrative focused on inspiring behaviors that the audience could apply in their daily lives, an approach that helped stabilize the discourse during moments of heightened emotional sensitivity. However, it is also important to note that the persistence of the debate has generated a phenomenon characteristic of prolonged discussions in digital environments, the proliferation of versions. As the story continued to spread, additional interpretations, independent analyses, and videos emerged that reframed the original messages from diverse perspectives. This ongoing process of reinterpretation is a sign that the case has ceased to belong exclusively to the actors involved and has become a cultural phenomenon collectively shaped by the audience. The case's influence has also had repercussions on the perception of the entertainment industry, especially in debates about the pressure exerted on public figures and the power dynamics that can operate in their professional environment. Although these discussions are not directly linked to verifiable facts of the case, they reflect a broader social trend, using high-impact emotional stories as a starting point to question structures that the audience perceives as opaque or unbalanced. This sociological phenomenon, known as externalization of grief, allows the emotions associated with a specific case to be projected onto broader systemic issues. Another relevant point is the impact on Yu Menglong's public image. Although his professional career was cut short by his death, the spiritual narrative and media frenzy generated a symbolic reconstruction of his image. In this new interpretive framework, the actor appears not only as an individual affected by tragic circumstances, but as a symbol of resistance and social awareness. This transformation is particularly notable because it developed without official intervention or planned campaigns. It was driven almost entirely by the digital community and by those who found an element of emotional resonance in the story. The case also raises questions about the relationship between grief, spirituality, and technology. Digital platforms have allowed narratives that were traditionally private, such as spiritual communications, to become widely discussed public topics. This phenomenon opens up a new field of study on how transcendental narratives are constructed and disseminated in highly connected societies. The hybridization of spirituality and digital environments creates a type of narrative that belongs neither entirely to the religious nor to the media sphere, but operates in an intermediate space where the symbolic becomes accessible and replicable. In terms of future scenarios, the narrative surrounding Yu Menglong is likely to continue evolving depending on three main factors: the flow of new messages or interpretations from mediums or content creators, the emergence of additional information, whether official or unofficial, related to the circumstances of his death, the persistence of social interest in issues related to justice, vulnerability, and public memory. These three elements will determine whether the story becomes an enduring symbol or gradually transforms into a case study within contemporary digital culture. The Yu Menglong case, as reconstructed from spiritual narratives and social reactions, constitutes a complex communicative phenomenon that combines collective mourning, symbolic reinterpretation, sociopolitical tensions, and the dynamics of digital virality. The absence of a widely accepted official narrative allowed the messages conveyed by Tai William and Thien Ha Tien Nu to temporarily occupy a discursive space that the audience perceived as empty. These messages, by offering a symbolic explanation of the event, served as a bridge between emotional uncertainty and the social need for coherence. The analysis reveals that the phenomenon's strength lay not in the spiritual nature of the messages, but in their ability to spark essential conversations about justice, dignity, collective responsibility, and vulnerability within power structures. The case demonstrates how, in a hyper-connected digital ecosystem, even unverifiable narratives can gain relevance if they offer an interpretive framework that resonates with deep social concerns. Finally, beyond its spiritual origins, the story of Yu Menglong has become a space for public reflection where memory, ethics, and the desire for social transformation converge. His legacy, as it has been shaped in this process, is not confined to the personal or artistic realm, but has been integrated into a broader dialogue about the relationship between human beings, institutions, and collective narratives.